Welcome to our second to last lecture in this series on I always say entrepreneurship, even though it's called Interpreneurship, related to our project that is funded by the Land Steiermark. Our speaker today, and Steve is actually very sorry that he can't be here today because Heinz Tschachler was his, is still, you could argue, his mentor, as he always likes to say, because Heinz introduced him primarily to Lewis and Clark, one of the key narratives in American culture, and hence brought him kind of into the field of American studies in a certain way. Heinz Tschachler, our speaker today, he actually completed his PhD here at the University of Graz, and then worked at the University of Klagenfurt for a couple of years, let's say couple without giving too much away, where he first was an assistant professor and then associate professor for American studies. He retired a couple of years back, but he's still very active. His research in recent years primarily focused on the one hand, key narratives of American culture, again, going back to the Lewis and Clark expedition, but also very much the significance of money and in particular coins and the design of coins in American culture and American presidents. And as an example of how active he still is, I'll pass around a little bit of promotional material in a couple of seconds. He just completed a book called George Washington, Political Fatherhood, which is supposed to come out in a couple of weeks, and another one called George Washington on Coins and Currency, coming out later this year. So, and his talk, as you can see here today, is on George Washington, the Godfather of American Entrepreneurism. Welcome, Heinz, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Michi. Thank you. I'm really glad to be here, and although I have to say this, I accepted the invitation kind of reluctantly, because as Michi said, I retired a couple of years ago and I was looking forward to quiet time. A friend of mine said, look, retirement means you have no more weekends off, and they were kind of prophetic words, but Stefan Rabic, Steve, who brought me on board, he will not accept no for an answer. You probably know that. And so this is why I'm here today, and ready to talk to you about George Washington, the Godfather of American Entrepreneurism. Take a look at the title, Godfather of American Entrepreneurism. I think there are certain implications in that title pertaining in particular to George Washington's wealth. I think it signifies that he probably was not a poor devil president. On the contrary, and you might have heard this before, of all the 45 US presidents, George Washington still ranks first as the wealthiest of all. And yet, when in April 1790 he prepared for his inauguration in New York City, which is then the nation's capital, he had to borrow 100 pounds at 6% interest just to make the trip. 100 pounds is about $20,000 in today's money. So how does that fit with the description of Washington as the godfather of American entrepreneurism, or as America's first commercial man, the prototype of the modern man of business? So over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to show you that in this instance, wealth and being in debt do fit, and not just in George Washington's instance. Oh yeah, and please do feel free to interrupt me at any point for questions, clarification, comments, etc. So let's get started with the claim of Washington as the richest president ever. What does that claim rest on? The presidential salary isn't going to make anyone rich. According to a law establishing the salaries of executive officers that the US Congress passed in 1789, the annual salary of the president was set at $25,000. It wasn't bad if we consider that at the time a pound of butter cost 13 cents. An ounce of gold could be had for just under $20 compared to like $1,500 today. But salaries notwithstanding, a number of American presidents, the founding father included, had plenty of their own. In August 2016, CNBC estimated the wealth of the chief executives during their terms of office, citing the 10 with the most assets. Now here's the list. And as you can see, George Washington is way ahead, $525 million in today's money. Followed by Thomas Jefferson, with only half of that, or about half of that. In third place, we have Theodore Roosevelt at 125. Fourth, Andrew Jackson. 5, James Madison. 6, Lyndon Johnson. 7, Herbert Hoover. 8, Bill Clinton. 9, Franklin Roosevelt. And 10, John F. Kennedy. And as you can see, among the first 5, only one is not a founder. So they were really pretty wealthy. And so my talk, I've divided it into 3 parts, and each representing a section in Washington's road to great wealth. At first, George Washington, as a land speculator. Part 2, Washington as a landowner and gentleman farmer. And thirdly, George Washington as an investor and entrepreneur. So Washington is a land speculator. Now here's what a biographer said. In no other direction did Washington demonstrate such acquisitiveness as in his quest for the ownership of land. Acquiring land was an enterprise that grew out of Washington's early career as a land surveyor and his first-hand experience of the frontier country which he had gained during the French and Indian War. But already as a boy, Washington often used his surveying skills as a party trick. What he did after dinner was he would survey the turnip patch for the Washington's guests. And he was so good at surveying that he could charge almost twice the going rate. He was usually paid in handfuls of cash or tobacco notes. He saved the bulk of it only to invest it in land later. His first land purchase was of almost 1,500 wilderness acres, that's about 600 hectares, somewhere in Virginia, in 1752, and he was only 20 years old then. And in the same year, he inherited an interest in the Mount Vernon family domain, which increased his holdings to over 4,000 acres. Eventually, he built Mount Vernon to more than 7,000 acres. That's about 3,000 hectares, with a workforce of almost 300 slaves. And he kept adding to his land holdings for the rest of his life, particularly along the western frontier. And eventually he secured title to more than 23,000 acres, in what would eventually become West Virginia. By the time of his death, Washington owned more than 52,000 acres, sprinkled from New York in the north through Pennsylvania and Maryland, to Virginia in the south, and Kentucky and the Ohio Valley in the west. That's altogether, there was something like 81 square miles, which is about 210 square kilometers. And to give you an idea of how vast his possessions were, this is almost half of the area of the state of Carinthia. So all these acres secured his position among the top-ranked landholding gentry, but it also translated into wealth that put him at number 59 in the list of the top 100 wealthy Americans through the ages. Does anyone know who tops that list? The wealthiest American ever. Go ahead. No? John D. Rockefeller, the oil refining magnate, and he was followed by John Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railway builder. Additionally, all these acres testify to Washington's conviction that land was the ultimate possession, far more important than money. Money, he wrote in a letter to one of his stepsons at the height of the War of Independence, money will melt like snow before a hot sun, but lands are permanent, rising fast in value. So what was he worth when he died? In 1799, in the year of his death, his estate was pegged at $780,000. In today's money, that would be anything between $20 and $80 million. Among his possessions, Mount Vernon was the single most valuable one. Now here's a map of the estate. The market value of Mount Vernon was estimated at $250,000. But its real value shows in the what economists call the relative prestige value of his wealth compared with the net worth of average Americans of the era. This prestige value, which includes all of his possessions, all his properties, and all of his holdings, amounts to about over $400 million in today's money. And that really reflects the serious wealth of the nation's first president. The data, I think, is mind-boggling. At the time of his death, Washington's estate was equivalent in value to almost 1/5 of 1%. That's 0.19% of the entire nation's GDP. Now listen to this. If Washington were living today and boasted a fortune worth 0.19% of the nation's approximately $19 trillion in terms of 2017 GDP, he would be worth approximately $15 to $18 billion. And which means that he would take 25th place in the Forbes list of seriously wealthy Americans, just one place down from Rupert Murdoch and his family, and way above the average net worth. Donald Trump, he's listed in approximately 250th place. Washington was not born to imperial purple, and he also was not by birth a member of the first families of Virginia. He was a true self-made man, a crafty and diligent entrepreneur, in the words of the historian Edward Langell. So on the one hand, he was hugely successful as a land speculator, but he added to his wealth when, after the death of his half-brother, he inherited an interest in Mount Vernon. There were also family connections. His half-brother had married into the Fairfax clan, one of Virginia's richest and most influential families. He also, at age 20, joined the Freemasons, a Masonic lodge in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which in those days was one of the best ways to meet the right folks. And 7 years later, 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis, the widow of a well-heeled gentleman planter and one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. She brought to the marriage some 18,000 acres of prime Virginia land, plus assets amounting to some 10,000 pounds, just under $2 million in today's money. That was a bounty which, by law, passed into her husband's care. And it catapulted George Washington from being a comfortably well-off country gentleman into one of Virginia's wealthiest landowners. And at Mount Vernon, Washington lived the life of a true Virginia gentleman, a proud member of the colony's ruling elite. Here's literature. Washington Irving, the writer. He produced a 5-volume biography of George Washington in the middle of the 19th century, just before the Civil War. And in this biography, he writes about the awe-inspiring effect produced by, and I'm quoting here, Washington's noble person and demeanor, his consummate horsemanship, the admirable horses he was accustomed to ride, and the aristocratical style of his equipments. There's a lovely footnote to this passage, which includes a description of the aristocratical order for clothes that Washington had sent to his London correspondent. Look at this. This is what he wanted. 2 complete livery suits for servants, a spare cloak, all other necessary trimmings for 2 suits more. I would have you choose the livery by our arms, only as the field of the arms is white. I think the clothes had better not be quite so, but nearly like the enclosed. The trimmings and facings of scarlet, and the scarlet waistcoat. If livery lace is not quite disused, I should be glad to have the cloaks laced. In addition, one set of horse furniture with livery lace, with a Washington crest on the housings, etc. The cloak to be of the same piece and color of the clothes. And finally, 3 gold and scarlet sword knobs, 3 silver and blue ditto, and 1 fashionable gold-laced hat. I'd like to draw your attention to the use of color. Scarlet. This was in 1755, and scarlet was the British colors, the redcoats, the military, for instance. 20 years later, he would not have ordered anything in scarlet, but in blue. So this order is from 1755, but the problem was that keeping up with the Joneses, as it were, in his case, the Fairfaxes, the Carters, the Robinsons of Virginia had its price. Now, Washington's purchases of outlandish fripperies and luxuries from London simply was beyond his means. So the London merchant, he bought Washington's tobacco crop, and in return shipped all kinds of exotic goods, along with agricultural accessories like plows and grass seed to Virginia. On Washington's want list of June 6, 1768 was a chariot. So it's a 4-wheeled vehicle, not a buggy, but really something which, as its modern equivalent, has perhaps a Rolls Royce or maybe a Maybach or something like that. So something flashy, made in the newest taste, handsome, genteel, and light. And on the harness, let my crest be engraved. Part 2, Washington as landowner and gentleman farmer. So when he sent this order to Robert Carey, his London correspondent, the value of his tobacco crop was falling. On the other hand, the luxuries were getting more and more expensive. So we ended up owing Carey about 800 pounds on the account, which is approximately $160,000 today. And the interest at 5% was rising. It was only when his stepdaughter, Patsy, died in 1773, and he received money from her estate that he was able to settle his account. What compounded Washington's financial difficulties were poor farming practices in America. And in 1766, Washington just about had enough, and he decided to opt out of tobacco. The crop had been introduced to Virginia in the early 17th century from South America, but it was extremely labor-intensive, that's one thing. It was also hard on the land, and it was increasingly unprofitable. So he decided to diversify to wheat, corn, flax, hemp. The important thing was that all these products he could sell domestically, which allowed him to operate outside the colonial system. As a landowner, he also introduced the mule to America. And the first animal he got was actually a gift from the King of Spain. You would also find on his estate cows, sheep, chickens, fish, and not to forget, a most profitable distillery. Distillery was begun by a Scottish farmer who had become Washington's estate manager. By 1799, Washington was one of America's largest producers of corn and rye whiskey. The annual output was about 11,000 gallons, and that's just under 42,000 liters. And the tax he had to pay on this amounted to about $7,000 in today's money. The distillery at Mount Vernon has been restored, and if you'd like to get a taste of what George Washington's whiskey probably tasted like, all right, you can do so at the premises. It's going to cost you a bundle, $185 a pop. By his own definition, Washington was a farmer, and not a planter. And he was a scientific farmer at that. Throughout his life, he sought out the latest book on agriculture and husbandry. He corresponded with the leading agriculturalists of his day, and he even joined various prestigious associations. The Philadelphia Society for the Promotion of Agriculture. And he also became, and that was already after the war, and after independence had been gained, an honorary member of the English Board of Agriculture. As I said, he was horrified at American farming practices of the time. In a letter to the English agriculturalist Arthur Young, he explained, "A piece of land is cut down and kept under constant cultivation, first in tobacco and then in Indian corn, in parentheses, two very exhausting plants, until it will yield scarcely anything. A second piece is cleared and treated in the same manner, then the third, and so on, until probably there's but little more to clear." So what was the impoverished landowner to do? According to Washington, either to recover the land, which is ruined, but he can't do that, to accomplish which he has perhaps neither the skill, the industry, nor the means. Second option, to retire beyond the mountains. See, westward expansion begins right here in Virginia. Or, third option, to substitute quantity for quality in order to raise something. Today, the image of Washington as a bold farmer entrepreneur is often lampooned, as in a cartoon speech balloon coming from his mouth saying, "I grew hemp." There's lots of stronger stuff. For instance, a 1994 painting by Alfred Quiroz. Washington inspects the hemp crop. You have three figures. George Washington in the middle, grinning. At the left, there is another gentleman smoking his pipe and also grinning. And at the right, you have a slave, a happy slave, puffing on his corncob pipe. It's obvious that all those three men are under the influence, marijuana. So the painting was a parody in various different ways. It parodies the numerous representations of Washington as a gentleman farmer, for one thing. But it also targets representations of Washington as a moral exemplar, a kind of tedious, unsmiling prig. And as someone under the influence, Washington appears utterly unheroic. But in the last instance, Quiroz alerts us to a much more sinister side to Washington's position as a gentleman farmer. Because like others of the gentlemen, Thomas Jefferson included, Washington was not particularly disturbed by the fact that he owed a good deal of his wealth to the exploitation of African Americans. For an 18th century gentleman farmer like Washington, it is also only natural to move into politics. And thanks to his connection, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, an early form of Congress. The assembly met in Williamsburg, Virginia, which was Virginia's capital, and Washington all of a sudden was at the center of the colony's elite. Following the War of Independence, Washington was elected to the Continental Congress, and in 1789 he became the nation's first president. But as he prepared for his inauguration in New York, he had to borrow money just to make the trip, because the Mount Vernon enterprise was often mired in cash flow problems. And from his midlife career as tobacco farmer onwards, Washington faced periods when debts mounted and his financial outlook lost its rosy glow. But Washington was by no means the only Virginia landowner to discover that farming was not the easiest route to riches. All of these people were at once civic and acquisitive, and they were chronically cash poor for a simple reason. Their speculation in land was always done on credit, on promises, on warrants, and not on cash. Still, they would at least try to hold on to their possessions. And importantly, what these people owned were not merely de facto possessions, but de jure possessions over which they had documented claims. Among the possessions which owners in colonial Virginia had documented claims, land has the most prestige by far. Remember, Washington to his stepson, lands are permanent, rising fast in value. And in a similar vein, he'd written another letter, land is the most permanent estate we can hold and the most likely to increase in value. So landed property offered the greatest security and therefore yielded, in other economic terms, the highest liquidity premium. So Washington's words are rooted in an economic order that was no longer content with material production, with reproduction and consumption, governed simply by custom. The economic order that Washington knew based value on property which, because it was secured by documented claims, could be freely disposed. Allow me an excursion into classical antiquity here, because the system of private property, which is specified and quantified in legally binding contract, goes back a long way to the beginning of the Greek polis and later to the Roman civitas. The Greek historian Thucydides, in his history of the Peloponnesian War, so 431 BCE, wrote that before the polis, hereditary kingdoms prevailed, and these kingdoms knew prerogatives, but not property rights. It was only with the emergence of the polis that wealth was introduced, gold brought to light, which easily robbed the strong and beautiful of their honor. So a complete change of social understandings and rules. The Roman statesman, orator, and philosopher Cicero was even more explicit. Private possessions, he said, are not so by nature, but by law, treaty, agreement, or lot. In his De Officiis, which he wrote in 44 BCE, the last year he was alive, insists on the duties of political leaders concerning property rights. Now here's a quotation. He who administers the affairs of the state must take special care that every man be defended in the possession of what rightfully belongs to him, and that there be no encroachment on private property by public authority. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? So what these classic sources reveal is that historically, de facto possession, which is the basis of feudal relations, had given way to economic contracts, okay, which are the basis of ownership economics. Ownership economics is a term introduced by two German economists, Gunnar Heinz and Otto Steiger. So I think it's terribly important to make this distinction between possession and ownership. So these are the implications of ownership, because property that is held de jure is private property over which the owners have documented claims. On the basis of these claims, this type of property can be sold, it can be mortgaged, or it can be loaned, and always with a view of appropriate returns. As for landed property, it's necessary to really work the land in order to secure the property. Land that's held by documented claims, it may pass through the generations as the inheritance of the eldest son, as in England, and later in the American South. But it always entails economic activities that make their owners behave like debtors. Washington dreaded being in debt, and he also always insisted that every payment due him was promptly paid. And throughout his life, he strained to keep the nightmare of being in debt from becoming a reality for either himself or his country. I also promised an excursion into American literature. Herman Melville, okay? I'm not going to talk about Moby Dick, but another one. But for Herman Melville, being dead too was a no-go. Here's a quote from his novel Typee, A Peep at Polynesian Life, which came out in 1846. In a primitive society, he wrote, the enjoyments of life, though few and simple, are spread over a great extent and are unalloyed by civilization. Unalloyed, they're simply and poor. But civilization, for every advantage she imparts, holds 100 evils in reserve. And among those evils are foreclosures of mortgages, protested notes, bills payable, debtors' prisons, or to sum up all in one word, money. My second example from Henry David Thoreau. He not only hated the emerging market economy, he also had a profound distrust of credit, that's to say of debt. You probably know his Walden, and in Walden, he figures that an average house costs about $800. What a waste of time, he wrote, to spend 10 to 15 years of one's life to lay up this sum. So, saving, okay? The sages of classical Greece, they would have laughed at this idea of laying up money for 15 years in order to buy a house. They would probably also rather be dead than to enjoy the purportedly unalloyed pleasures of Polynesian life that Melville dreamed himself into. The Greeks had just gotten out of a primitive society. Hesiod, the first economist of the Western world, as it were, admonishes one of his characters to hope no more, the willing bounty nor the borrowed store. Insensate Perseus, be the labor's thine. So you better get to work, which the good gods to earthly man assign. Did exhortation move, thy thought should be from debt releasement, days from hunger free. So it's a call to labor, to work hard. So work was a guiding principle as early as the 5th century BCE. Now here's Hesiod again. From labor, men returns of wealth behold, flocks in their fields, and in their coffers gold. From labor shalt thou with the love be blessed of men and gods, the slothful they detest, slothful, lazy, idle. The Greek sage may have been too remote for Washington's contemporaries, but the Romans definitely were not. And the writings, both of Livius and Virgil, secured property such as land figures as the basis of wealth. And as in Hesiod, work, not idleness, figures as a key social value. Here's Virgil. Thus roused by varied wants, new arts arose. Strenuous labor triumphed at its close. So it was a triumph of work on the basis of private property, which marks the beginning of a new age, but not the beginning of the age of Protestantism. And that age, according to Max Weber, was characterized by work ethos that sees material success as an indication of the salvation of one's soul, a belief that's still held dear today. The problem with Weber, I think, is that, or his thesis is that it does nothing to account for the Catholic Medicis of Florence, or the Fuggers of Augsburg, who were also Catholics. In fact, what Weber's Protestant work ethos most convincingly explains is a piece of English writing. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. As regards the Calvinistic roots of American entrepreneurialism, the topic of Dan Shanahan's lecture sometime in December, they may be good to explain Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, which contains wisdoms such as a penny saved is a penny earned, or industry pays debts. But Calvinism altogether fails to explain Franklin's autobiography. Now, what does he say in the autobiography? He says, oh, all right, I was brought up a Presbyterian. But I early absented myself from the public assemblies of the sect, Sunday being my studying day. So he didn't go to church on Sunday. Instead, he read books, which is a grave sin at the time, at least among Protestants, radical Protestants. For the 19th century, yes, Calvinism certainly does duty for Horatio Alger's From Rags to Rich Sagas. But America's founders, they were not radical or even pious Protestants or disciples of John Calvin. They shuddered at the thought that the jealous and wrathful God had left no room for freedom, for free agency. And they also found the call for worldly asceticism as repulsive as the idea of relentless activity in order to increase the glory of God. The founders rather were theistic rationalists. They believed in God's providence. To an extent, they also believed in the efficacy of prayer, but in not much else. Most of America's founders, in fact, at least nominally belonged to established churches, not to any Protestant sects, but to established churches. Washington, for instance, was Episcopalian. And the American Episcopal Church is actually an offshoot of the English Anglican Church. And a prominent member of the Anglican Church was the philosopher John Locke. God was still important to John Locke. And so in his major writings, such as Two Treatises of Government, which came out in 1690, Locke wrote that God, when he gave the world in common to all mankind, commanded man also to labor. So it's the classics all over again. The quotation is from a chapter in the second treatise titled Of Property, from which we also learn that among all the labors that the human condition requires, working the land is the privileged one. As much land as the man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property. But more important, Locke defines the right to property as a premier human right, an original law of nature. So the right to property as a human right. So, I wonder what I'd do now to get this. Oh, it's only disappeared on my notebook here. The question that troubled John Locke was, what good is property if it is not guaranteed, if it is not secured by law? So Locke goes on to say, established laws no action. Established laws of liberty to secure protection and encouragement to the honest industry of mankind are the trademark of a wise and godlike ruler. So in other words, laws that regulate the right of property and the possession of land are essential. Only titled property, Locke writes in a later chapter, is secured. So the supreme power, the sovereign, cannot take from any man part of his property without his consent. For the preservation of property being the end of government, and that for which men enter into society, it necessarily supposes and requires that the people should have property. Men, therefore, in society having property, they have such rights to the goods, which by the law of the community are theirs, that nobody has a right to take their substance or any part of it from them without their consent. For Washington, the right to property also was both a matter of principle and it was integral to a stable civil society. Protecting the right to property, in fact, was one of the reasons the War of Independence was fought, especially after the British had begun to attack the colonists' private property. And Locke's thoughts, mind you, Locke's thoughts on property, they are echoed in the Declaration of Independence, except that there they appear as the pursuit of happiness. So the Americans kind of toned down Locke's more radical words. And Locke's thoughts on property also figure prominently in the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. It was ratified in 1791 as part of the Bill of Rights, and it offers protection against, quote-unquote, unwarranted seizure. So nobody has the right to take their substance or any part of it from them without their own consent. Unwarranted seizure. It's a constitutional right. Now, all this goes to say that in 18th century America, secured property was one of the most potent and consequential ideals, much as it also was a dominant cultural investment. Property is a matter of progress, a British social philosopher had written, and the industry by which it is gained or improved is in reality a principal distinction of nations in the advanced state of mechanic and commercial arts. Adam Smith agreed in The Wealth of Nations that individual property was a core difference between civilized societies and savage ones. In 18th century America, landed property was related to working it. This became the basis of civic virtue, and it conveyed status and authority. George Washington was furious that Britain was taxing the colonists without their consent, and he urged resistance 2 years before independence was declared. No power upon earth can compel us to do otherwise, till they have first reduced us to the most abject state of slavery that was ever designed for mankind. In the end, however, Washington knew that Mount Vernon's glorified facade of wealth and grandeur only covered up an operation that was at best only marginally profitable. And for that reason, he over the years became an intrepid figure in financial investment and risky enterprise, and not the least of which was the development of the new national capital, whose location on the Potomac had been decided upon in 1790. And with his involvement in the capital venture, Washington really fashioned for himself a new mode of economic selfhood, and one that was truly key to the emerging market economy. And I'm finally coming to my third part, Washington as an entrepreneur and investor. The image of Washington as an entrepreneur, as an economic visionary, has been part of the Washington legend from early on. Here's a painting by Edward Savage, The Washington Family, 1796. What the scene depicts is a typical upper bourgeois household with everything that entails a rigid order, hierarchized gender role. Everyone is in his or her proper place, and each and everyone performs a normative social role of early Republican domestic life. We have Martha Washington, right? She's dressed in brocade and silk, together with her two grandchildren from a first marriage. And there's also the domestic servant, and who's black, and which indicates the origin of George Washington from America's South. And then there's George Washington, the paterfamilias, who's depicted almost in life size. The painting actually is huge. It measures just over 2 meters by 3 meters. So it's a huge painting. He's wearing his general's uniform. Also, take a look at his boots. There's spurs on his boots. And the jaws are set. And so all that evokes the revolutionary hero, of course. But then there are other details. There's a black hat. There's the dress sword that's on the table. And there are also various papers. And they all speak of President Washington, ready to leave his home at a moment's notice. So the painting, of course, represents the nation's first family. But at the same time, it depicts them as a nation's or as a family of economic visionaries. Have a look at the center. They're grouped around a table. What do you see on the table? It's a kind of map, right? In actual fact, it's it's Andrew Ellicott's plan of the new national capital. The new national capital was a highly controversial scheme at the time, and it created a lot of division, political division. On the one hand, you had the Federalists, George Washington included, who were all for it. They wanted a centralized power, and the nation's capital would symbolize just that. On the other hand, the Democrats or Democratic Republicans with Thomas Jefferson, they hated it. They thought it was totally unnecessary, it was way too expensive, it was a swindle, and it was simply stupid. Andrew Ellicott actually adapted the plan from the original designer, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. But Ellicott had added embellishments, and he also highlighted the more than 1,100 squares of purchasable property as investment opportunities. Let's take a look at George Washington again. He's seated in his ornate chair, but he has his left arm on a copy of the street plan, kind of gazes into the future, as if we're engaged in some calculations, perhaps even envisioning the Grand Avenue, which is now Pennsylvania Avenue, where the White House, the president's mansion, would be located. If you take a more closer look, the pommel of Washington's sword hovers over one purchasable property. Martha's fan, the tip of this fan covers another piece of property just north of the Capitol. And the Washingtons would buy 2 lots, and in which their contractors would eventually buy 2 townhouses. So the painting of 1796 affirms the capital venture and its long-term viability. And at the same time, it advances a new vision of property ownership, a vision that's definitely key to the priorities of a market economy. Fungible properties, real estate, bonds, stocks, which are all, unlike land, volatile and fluid. They're held for sale, they're held for mortgaging, and they're held for yielding returns. So volatility, fluidity, selling, mortgaging, waiting for returns, all these terms suggest risk. It was the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, in his theory of economic development, described the entrepreneur quite explicitly as a risk taker, an innovator, a thinking force in business. Typically, Schumpeter wrote, an entrepreneur is not content with material reproduction. An entrepreneur doesn't save up. When an entrepreneur implements an innovative project, he wants to make a profit and therefore is willing to assume debts. A generation later, the British economist John Maynard Keynes borrowed from Schumpeter in his claim that what drives an enterprise is not thrift, it's not laying up money, okay, but profit. Profit, represented in monetary terms, becomes a bridge between the present and the future. The Oxford English Dictionary says that the word entrepreneur derives from a French verb, entreprendre, which means to undertake. Originally, the word referred to a director or a manager of a musical institution, or simply someone who gets up entertainment. It was only later that it became absorbed into political economics. And in these terms, an entrepreneur is a person who sets up business or businesses, taking on financial risks. The word itself, the word entrepreneur, was introduced into economics by an Irish-born Parisian banker by the name of Richard Cantillon. Richard Cantillon. His essay sur la nature du commerce général is widely considered the first great systematic work of economics. The essay came out in 1720. I have no idea whether the German economist and sociologist Werner Sombart ever read Cantillon's essay. What is known is that in the late 1800s, Sombart traveled to the United States to determine why American workers rejected socialism. Now, this is what Sombart found. For the average American, being successful means first and foremost becoming rich. Now, this explains why the restless striving, which we recognize as an essential part of the American national character, is applied before all else to economic life. In America, the best and most energetic people apply themselves to financial careers, whereas in Europe, they go into politics. Well, that was from 1906. In the mass public, an excessive evaluation of economic matters develops for the same reason, namely because people believe that in this sphere they can most easily reach the goal for which they strive. Now, what Sombart also found was that the greater intensity put into his labor by the American worker is only the extension of his fundamentally capitalist disposition, a fundamentally capitalist disposition. In other words, with Americans, capitalism is in their cultural DNA. Sombart had his limits. What he didn't see was that the difference between American and European worker was not just the American's desire to get rich, but the opportunity to actually do so by enterprise. Sombart also wrongly and erroneously believed that the worker's capitalist disposition would soon disappear along with all other factors preventing socialism. Let's return to George Washington. In 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence, the Scottish nationalist economist, and philosopher Adam Smith published an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Smith simply could not comprehend a society without property, and not even in the early state, as in a tribal nation of hunters. So what he regards as property at a more advanced stage is merely transformed from common property to individual or private property. So for Smith, profit and rent of land are the specific characteristics of private property. The Wealth of Nations would become a world bestseller. And George Washington also bought and carefully studied Smith's work. And he found his own experience of self-interest and property ownership confirmed. And as the bicentennial of Washington's birth was approaching, 1932, President Calvin Coolidge called him the first commercial American. It was a pioneer idea, instinct with genius, and Washington's advocacy of the idea of possessing the wealth of commercial relations marks him as the first commercial American, the first man typical of the American that was to be. Coolidge was not the only prominent American to look towards George Washington as a model entrepreneur. A historian, Claude Bowers, describes Washington as a rather hard businessman, a forerunner of the modern captain of industry. a writer and biographer, William Woodward, cast the adult Washington the image of a pragmatic Wall Street tycoon of the 1920s. Now here's William Woodward. Washington had no religious feeling himself, but thought that religion was a good thing for other people, especially for the common people. Anyone who understands American life will recognize the modern captain of industry attitude and this point of view. Can we go now? No, not quite. First, let me do a summary of sorts, okay? So what I've tried to show you in my talk was that Washington's wealth came from three sources. Most of it can be traced to success as a land speculator, because he was a surveyor and he had a great experience of the frontier country. He added to his wealth through inheritance of various family connections, membership in his Masonic lodge, and finally through marriage. Secondly, he was also a gentleman farmer. His lifestyle at Mount Vernon was, however, largely owed to the toil of slaves. And moreover, Mount Vernon was at best marginally profitable. So over the years, he became a fearless figure in financial investment and risky enterprise, the third pillar of his wealth. His ingenious, as I've showed you, was first enshrined in the Washington family, Edward Savage's famous painting. The painting was done in 1796. It was just 3 years before Washington's death. And so in more general terms, we can say that the final years of America's first president really marked the moment when traditional aristocratic values of Virginia and of wealth rooted in land gave way to a speculative capitalist economy dominated by risk-taking entrepreneurs. Literature again. And I think the classic example is Theodore Dreiser's novel, The Financier. Yeah. But Washington was a punctilious businessman and a landowner throughout his life, a man who loved to count, to measure, and weigh his possessions. He also didn't speak a foreign language. He didn't much appreciate art. He didn't read for pleasure. When he died, his library contained about 900 volumes, the vast majority of which were concerned with agricultural and commercial matters. So Washington's mind, we can say, was always concerned with details of business. And so Alfred Ritter, United States district judge, termed him the prototype of the modern man of business, a pretty successful one at that. So, and I think it's entirely fitting, therefore, that the United States placed a portrait of the godfather of American entrepreneurism on its most common paper currency, the $1 bill. A lot of what I said today can be found in the two books which Mickey already announced. Here are the titles and the front covers, and with this little bit of self-advertising, you'll be delighted to hear that it finally reached the end. Thank you very much.